So I got a question. Do you want to be the problem at your commander table for $15? You probably do, because you're here watching one of my videos and I do not build non-degenerate decks. So, if you want to be the problem at your commander table, basically telling everybody when and how they're allowed to cast spells and keep things at the table, then let me introduce you to one of the most fun budget commanders you can actually build. Now, she came into pre-con, like a lot of the stuff that I'm covering first on this channel, and she uses a mechanic that not a lot of people are super familiar with, but she is Sephirus of the Hidden Ways. Whenever one or more creatures you have are put into the graveyard from anywhere, venture into the dungeon. This ability only triggers once per turn, and when you complete a dungeon, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, I know that this may come as a shock to you, but the dungeon mechanic is actually really, really simple, but there's a lot of people who have troubles with it because it's kind of confusing. But basically, let's go over what a dungeon is, why you would go into one before we do anything else. Here, let's pull this up. So, a dungeon is you going in to one of these 3 locations: the Lost Mines of Fendelver, the Tomb of Annihilation, or the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Whenever you enter a dungeon, you choose the first area of the dungeon to go into. So you would go into either this cave entrance, this trapped entry, or this yawning portal. When you go into each dungeon, as you go further in, you have to pick a side. So if you're in the cave entrance, you can go to the Goblin Lair. This will make a 1/1 Goblin token, or you can go to the Mine Tunnels. If you are in any location in the dungeon, you can only go to an adjacent attached room that is further down the dungeon. So you can, from the Mine Tunnels, go into either the Dark Pool or the Fungi Caverns, but you cannot go into the storeroom because that is attached to the Goblin Lair. Now, whenever you complete a dungeon, you are taken out of the dungeon entirely, and you have to enter the dungeon again to go back into one. Now, that is not to say there's not another way to do dungeons. There is also the initiative mechanic, which is this one right here. If you have the initiative, you go instead into the Undercity. You don't get a choice. With dungeons, you can choose one of the 3. With the Undercity, you are forced to go directly into here. You would go into Secret Entrance, get a basic land from your library, and then choose which side you want to go down. The way the initiative works is if you have it, it's like Monarch. You will hold on to the initiative so long as you have not taken combat damage from everybody, and on your upkeep, you will continue to go further and further down the initiative's dungeon. Any card that says enter the dungeon will put you further down the initiative's dungeon as well. Any card that says give you the initiative will put you further down one of these dungeons if you happen to be in them. It just depends on which one you're in at the time. Hopefully that's not too complicated for anybody. If not, we can go ahead and get into Sephirus of the Hidden Ways. So, this commander is bonkers and lets you do all kinds of nutty shit at a table. Like, just an inordinate amount of nutty shit at a table. It's actually kind of sad, the amount of lines that a deck like this has that you can use to just destroy people or become a problem at your commander table. But let's go ahead and go over how she functions. If you complete a dungeon, you may resurrect any creature from your graveyard. This is going to be important. This is going to be very, very important. So, as such, let's start with the dungeon mechanic that we're going to be using. Veteran Dungeoneer goes into the dungeon when it enters the battlefield. Fate's Reversal pulls a creature out of our grave, puts it into our hand, and then allows us to go into a dungeon. Vicious Battle Rager also lets us go into a initiative dungeon when it enters the battlefield, and the rest of the text isn't important. Cloister Gargoyle lets us go into the dungeon when he comes out. Displacer Beast lets us go into the dungeon when he comes out. Aarakocra Sneak lets us use the Initiative's dungeon when it comes out. Barrowin is a secondary commander for the deck, functionally. It goes into the dungeon when it comes out, and when it attacks, if you have completed a dungeon, you may return any creature from your graveyard from the battlefield to the from the graveyard to the battlefield. I can't speak. You can go from the graveyard to the battlefield so long as the creature has mana value 3 or less. So this allows us to reanimate a bunch of stuff. It can also let us reanimate our commander, which is important. Ravenloft Adventurer lets you get the initiative when it comes out. It also acts as a stacks piece. If your opponent has a creature that would die, you instead exile it. And if it attacks you, if you completed a dungeon, they lose life equal to every card that is owned in exile with a hit counter. That part's almost never going to be relevant, but it is a secondary win con for the deck if you stack up enough hit counters. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer has us going into the Initiatives dungeon when it comes into play, and it has a very important effect. This is another one of our secondary win cons. If you cast your second spell a turn, copy it. But if you've completed a dungeon, copy the spell twice. I'm going to get into why this effect is bullshit very soon. Nadar goes into the dungeon both when he comes into the field and attacks, and gives all of our creatures 1/1 if you've completed a dungeon. And the star of our deck, Radiant Solar, says that if it or another non-token creature comes onto the battlefield, enter the dungeon, you can also discard it to go into the dungeon, and gain 3 life. So, why is the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer bullshit? Well, let's say you've completed a dungeon, which just means playing any of the 4 cards that got us through them, or having 4 creatures die while Sephris was on the board. You've completed a dungeon. You may play Radiant Solar not once, but 3 times. Each Radiant Solar will see each other Radiant Solar. This will allow you to go into the dungeon multiple times. So let's say you have your commander on the board. Here is Sephris. Her effect is, when you complete a dungeon, resurrect a creature. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer is out. We're creating 3 Radiant Solar copies. Well, we're creating 3 Radiant Solars, right? We get to copy the spell twice. So there's our original Radiant Solar, 2 token copies. We are going into the Lost Mines of Phandelver. The first Radiant Solar touches the board, sees the other 2 Solars, it goes into the dungeon. Then the other 2 Radiant Solars see it. So you go into the dungeon twice more. And then the next Radiant Solar goes into the dungeon, completing the dungeon for you. That's fun. You get to resurrect 1 creature. The other Radiant Solars saw that. You go into the dungeon 3 times because you summoned the creature. You still have the dungeon stacks from the original Radiant Solar. So you're going further into the dungeon, summoning another creature. That creature might have a dungeon trigger. Do you see how out of hand this gets? If there's multiple Radiant Solars on the board, which there can be very easily because of our copies mechanics, you get lots of dumb shit. You get to go into the dungeon lots of times, draw lots of cards, make a ton of treasures, and summon basically your entire graveyard onto the battlefield. It's a little stupid. This card is the star. This card is the star of our deck in every way, shape, and form. If you've played a Sephris deck, Radiant Solar is the card that you are terrified if it ever leaves your graveyard. But how are we going to actually get to the point where we can play things like Radiant Solar? Well, we're never going to play her. We're just going to discard her out of our hand. That's what we're going to do. But let's say that you do want to get mana. Okay. So the 2 tokens will trigger off the original one, but none of them triggers from the tokens. Right, the 2 tokens will trigger off the original one, and then your revive will happen. And since your revive is happening, because remember, each Radiant Solar is triggering once, and then the original Radiance, the 2 token Radiant Solars see the main Radiant Solar, so you have 5 Radiant Solar triggers.
Woot.
Thank you for the woot. You have 5 Radiant Solar triggers that are happening. This completes a dungeon, and then summons a creature from your graveyard, completing the dungeon again, because now there's 8 total triggers. But if the creature that came out has a complete the dungeon mechanic on it, like Nadar does, then it just auto-completes the dungeon and resets this whole thing. As long as you're pulling creatures that say complete the dungeon or get the initiative, this will just keep stacking until you run out of creatures to pull out of the graveyard. The Solars don't need to see the token Solars for this to just empty out a grave onto the board in a vomitous fashion. But you've got ramp you need to get to. You need to be able to cast a bunch of spells. So Core Cartographer and the rest of our ramp package are here for you. This creature lets us get any planes from our deck onto the battlefield. That includes non-basic planes. That's important because we actually have some fetchable lands in the deck that we want to be able to play. Merconvert is a 2-mana mana rock on a body. We pay 2 life for it to happen, but we have gaining life as part of the dungeon, so we're never actually going to feel this loss of life. Not in any way that really matters. Then we have, of course, the diamond sets, because all the diamonds are very cheap mana rocks. Honored Heirloom, which lets us exile cards from a graveyard whenever we use it. It's also one of my favorite mana rocks, because it's any mana rock that lets us blow up graveyards. Command Sphere, which is here because it is a very cheap any mana rock, and we have a 3-mana commander, and we need to be able to get the mana for it specifically. Otherwise, I would have put something that was just a non-colored mana rock in here. But our commander really wants to come out early. So, if we're in the event where we have 3 mana, but we don't have the 3 mana we need because we are running with a budget mana base, Commander Sphere is here for that. Prismatic Lens is also here as a 2-mana rock that also lets us filter mana. Ornithopter of Paradise, 2-mana mana rock that's on a body. And then, of course, Sad Robot. Solemn Simulacrum is kind of an all-star in this deck. Whenever it comes into play, you get a land onto the battlefield, and you draw when it dies. You can make this man die a lot. You can make this man suffer. If you have a Sad Robot, make everybody know why he's sad. It's very important. This card can be summoned from the grave so many times by Sephiroth that you'll empty your deck out of basics and just be super high up on cards in hand, especially if you manage to get him out with things like your Radiant Solar on the board. Speaking of reanimation, we have other ways we want to reanimate. Let's go ahead and start with Victimize. Choose 2 creatures in a grave, put it on the battlefield after sacking a creature. This means we can't put the creature that we chose originally with Victimize as part of the ensemble to come onto the board, but that's fine. We can use this to get back cards that our opponents don't like. We can also use this to recycle our creatures that have powerful ETBs, like our Sun Titan. Gets anything with a converted mana cost 3 or less from our grave to the battlefield. This also includes lands. That's very important. He can get lands. We have fetching lands in here. Not fetch lands, but fetching lands, and quite a few of them. So if we don't have any permanents in the grave that we want to get out, otherwise we can use him to just basically ramp. Karmic Guide, we never care about paying that Echo, because that Echo triggers Sephiroth, but this allows us to get a creature from the battlefield. This is also a card that we can use for an infinite combo. That's going to be kind of important. We have Dread Return, which lets us return a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield, but also we can sack creatures to activate it, which means that it can trigger Sephiroth. Sister Hospitaller. This lets us get any creature from the grave onto the battlefield, and then we gain life equal to its mana value. There's actually a game that I did on Mental Misplays Commander Nights that involved me using the Sister Hospitaller to keep resetting my life back to 40 and just infuriating the table over and over again. And then one of my favorite reanimation pieces of all time, the Altar of Baal. Never make the Bone Offering with this. Always pay 2 to drop it on the board early, and then every time your opponents get rid of one of your problem creatures, get rid of one of the tokens that your dungeon creates to summon a creature from your grave for 3 mana over and over and over again. This card is a house. Please build the house more often. But now we have to know, if we're going to build a house, how are we going to draw the cards to get to that house? Well, we have a very extensive draw package to make that happen. The dungeon gives us a draw package in itself, but we're going to supplement that a bunch with all of these cards. And if you notice, every card of ours that draws a card can also trigger our commander, and this is important. Fact or Fiction, reveal the top 5 cards of your library, hand them to an opponent, they separate them into piles, pick a pile, 1 pile goes to the grave, 1 pile goes to your hand. Throw the pile away that has the creature, because it will trigger Sephiroth. Hostile Negotiation, also known as Blackter Fiction, is the same type of card, except one of the piles is unknown to your opponent. This lets you throw things into the grave, again. Mole Drifter, we can evoke this to draw 2 cards, which will kill the Mole Drifter, which will allow us to trigger Sephiroth again. The Everflowing Well comes into play, you mill 2 cards, and then you draw 2 cards. That can trigger Sephiroth. That's fun. It's just a 3-mana draw 2. It's a divination that triggers our commander. And if we have 8 or more permanents in the grave, we can flip it to a card that says when you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by the pools, up to any target permanent becomes a copy of that spell. So, Why would you ever want to use this? You already know why. We want to copy Radiant Solar! We want to copy Tomb of Horrors Adventurer. Because if you finished a dungeon, and you use this to create a clone of Tomb of Horrors Adventurer, the second spell you cast in that turn is copied 4 times. You get 5 copies of that spell. So what happens if you have your copied Tomb of Horrors Adventurer and then you just drop 5 copies of Nadar? Or 5 copies of the Ravenloft Adventurer? You get to auto-complete the Undercity in one fell swoop? Do you know how bonkers that is? The Undercity's ability lets us reveal the top 10 of our deck and get a creature out for free from it. There are so many games I've won just off of doing the flip of the Undercity. And this card, if we ever get the Myriad pulls online, this lets us choose our best Dungeoneer. And we get to abuse it. Whether it's the Radiant Solar or whether it is the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer, we get to abuse the ever-loving heck out of one of those cards. But if you notice, we need to continue the trend of every card we have that can draw us cards also discarding us cards. Dihada's Ploy is really important. We can draw 2 cards with it and discard 1 card, and then we gain life equal to the number of cards we've discarded this turn. That part's not super important. What's important is it has Jumpstart. This means that we can discard a card from our hand and cast this again from the graveyard. We get to cast this card multiple times, and because this card triggers our commander, we get to use it multiple times on other people's turns. We get to trigger our commander ourselves, and then pass to an opponent's turn. At the end of their turn, cast Dihada's Ploy from our hand, and then when they go to the next person's turn, cast Dihada's Ploy from our graveyard on their turn. 1 turn cycle gave us 3 triggers of our commander, and we got to draw 4 cards and discard 2. Meaning we probably put the card we want to reanimate with our commander in the grave with Dihada's Ploy. On that same note, we have Faithful Mending. Same idea. Draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, gain 2 life, and it has a flashback ability like Dihada's Ploy does, so we can cast this card from our graveyard once, just like Dihada's Ploy. This is doing the same thing for us. We're drawing cards, discarding cards, triggering our commander, using it multiple times. We're getting the most bang for our buck out of this. Then we have Vohar, Vidalian Desecrator. We can draw a card, discard a card with it, and then make everybody burn for a little bit. Not super important, but it is something that we can do with it to get us closer and closer to winning the game. We can also sack it to get an instant or sorcery from our graveyard and cast it, which just lets us reuse powerful instants and sorceries. Champion of Wits comes into the board and lets us draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. This card is another house because I lied to you. He doesn't read that way. He says draw cards equal to his power. So, as an example, just to let you know, here's a thing you get to do. Let's say you're in the Undercity, right? And you're about to do the Throne of the Dead 3. If you flip up Champion of Wits, this gives him 3 1/1 counters when he comes onto the board, drawing you 5 and discarding 2, after you already got him for free. It's just all kinds of advantage laced with cocaine. It is an amazing card that is abused by our deck's mechanics. We can also eternalize him in a pinch. Merfolk Looter is a very standard lower-level copy of Vohar. Just tap it, draw a card, discard a card. If you have space to put more cards like this in your deck, please find a way to put them in. They do all kinds of work. But I've talked about some really strong cards. How are we going to get those cards to our hand? Well, not just by drawing. We're also going to cast our tutors. Yes, we managed to get tutors in this deck for no money, basically. Just none. And we don't have a Knowing to Procession in here, Dappers. No. Ring Sight. The ring tempts us, and then we search our library for any card that shares a color with a legendary creature we control, reveal it, put it into our hand. Now note, Ring Sight makes a creature legendary because a ring bearer is always legendary. This card will allow you to go into your deck and get anything of any color if Sephiroth is on the board, or allow you to get anything of a color that's already on your board if it's out. If you're looking for budget ways to tutor, this is a 23-cent tutor, and it's not quite to the 4-mana casting cost that the Diabolic Tutor is at. But at 4 mana, we do have another tutor, Violent Tumor. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for any card and put it into the graveyard. If you have an instant or sorcery you need to cast with Vohar, this will throw it into the grave. If you need to trigger your commander, this will trigger the commander. If you need to put one of the WinCon creatures into the grave, this will go ahead and tutor it up for you. This card is bonkers strong, and I only wish it costed less mana. But speaking of triggering our commander, we need to have a pretty strong sack outlet, because triggering our commander is very, very important, and doing it at instant speed, just in case somebody tries to hit us with some sneaky removal, is also important. So we have 2 creatures that can do instant speed sacking, and that is the Phyrexian Ghoul and the Viscera Seer. Viscera Seer also gives us a scry off of it, which is nice. Then we have 3 ways to do one-time sack draws, which is Cauldron. We can sack a creature, gain a life, draw a card. Relic Vial lets us sack a creature, gain a life, or lets us sack a creature and draw a card. And Vampiric Rites lets us sack a creature and draw a card and gain a life. Notably, the Relic Vial has an extra ability with Clerics on the board, and we actually have a couple Clerics in the deck, so this card will be online sometimes. And then a star from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan that I adore, Tarian's Journal. This is another sack a creature, draw a card, but it can't be done at instant speed like our other options. What it does have, though, is a really nifty ability to flip into the Tomb of Alcatraz. And the Tomb lets us cast any creature from our graveyard and then put a finality counter on it, which means the creature will not trigger our commander if it dies, but we do get to reuse its ETB, which can be very important. But speaking of ETBs, our creature package, our removal package, rather, is very, very heavy. We have 18 forms of removal in this deck, 18 forms of interaction. I've been told this is excessive. I don't care. Let's start with the Baleful Beholder. When it comes into the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices an enchantment, or you can give your entire go-wide board Menace if you've built it. Most of the time, we're using this just to 1 for 3 enchantments, and we're doing it at the speed of whatever Sephiroth can summon. Bar the Gate lets us counter a creature or planeswalker spell and then venture into the dungeon, hopefully triggering Sephiroth. Meteor Golem, if you're playing a budget deck, you probably have one of these stuffed somewhere. Destroy any non-land permanent at ETB, summon it with Sephiroth to get rid of problem cards. Precipitous Drop. This is a personal favorite of mine. This gives a creature neg 2, or if you finish the dungeon, which you will, neg 5. And if this enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. So we get to use this card as a way to get rid of indestructible creatures and also trigger our dungeons. Then we have Bone Shards as another way of destroying shit. Destroying a creature or planeswalker by discarding a card or sacking a creature. So this triggers Sephiroth and gives us free stuff. The Ronum Unicorn is also neat. It was in the Precon 2. You can sack it to destroy any enchantment at instant speed. Sometimes you will use this to blow up your own stuff if you desperately need to trigger Sephiroth when something like a board wipe is happening and you need to get Sephiroth's ability out post-haste. This is a way that you can do that if you need to. It's a really, really niche scenario, but it can happen. Otherwise, use it to blow up your opponent's enchantments. People don't blow up enchantments enough. Then the Locust Heavy Destroyer is another fun all-star for the deck. This card makes everybody sack a creature, and then you can pay 8 mana to reanimate it yourself, or you can get it back with Sephiroth. Take your pick. The Stronghold Biologist says that you can discard a card from your hand and counter any creature spell. Do you know how bonkers it is to just use this creature to counter other creature spells while triggering Sephiroth's ability every single time? This card gets removed from boards quick the minute players do the usual of picking it up and reading it and remembering what the hell it does. The Primaris Eliminator, this is basically our budget Massacre Worm. It can either destroy a creature or make all creatures an opponent controls get neg 2, neg 2. Negate allows us to counter target non-creature spells. Mortify lets us destroy enchantments or creatures. Wizard's Retort allows us to counter any target spell, and it costs 1 less if our commander is out because they happen to be a wizard. Angel of Runes is a very interesting removal spell. This has plane cycling. We can use this to grab any land from our deck, basically, because we have fetchable targets. And when it enters the battlefield, exile 2 target artifacts or enchantments. This is an amazing card. This triggers Sephiroth when we cycle it to get a good card, and now it's automatically in the grave to revive, and it's a 2-for-1 on enchantments and artifacts. We can use this to get rid of so many pesky cards. Now, a card that makes a lot of people really salty, it's in the slot here, is Butcher of Malakir. All the sacrificing we're doing in the deck, yeah, this is going to trigger Butcher of Malakir, making everybody lose cards. Another card people really hate is Ashen Rider. When it enters the battlefield or dies to our sacking spells, we can just exile a permanent, any permanent, even a land. We can just use this to get rid of anything we don't like. We also have a clone in here, the Calidus Assassin. At flash speed, it can come into the battlefield tapped as a copy of any creature, and then if it has the same name as another target creature, you can just destroy that creature. This thing is really, really strong. Ravenous Chupacabra lets us just blow up a creature when it comes onto the board, and Plaguecrafter is another version of the Locust Heavy Destroyer. When it comes into play, everybody sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker. Everybody you can't discards a card. This card triggers our commander and also makes us enemy of everybody on the board really, really quickly. It's a very, very good card, and I highly recommend playing it if you do have access to them. They're 37 cents. You have access to them. But now, what happens if the board gets a little out of control? Well, you got a couple ways to deal with that. You have Ondu Inversion, an 8-mana board wipe that fits into our land slot because it happens to be an MDFC. Always run these if you have the space for them. Blow up all non-land permanents. You're a reanimation deck. You can recover from this. Ideally, your opponents can't. And then the Necromantic Selection, blow up all creatures, and then get any creature from the grave and put it back into play. Any creature that was sent with this card. 9 times out of 10, you're going to use this to just get back your commander. Oftentimes, you're going to use this to pull back like Ashen Rider and just punish somebody way further with that card. And finally, we have one more way of copying cards. We have a single copy of Mirror Image in the deck. We could go for a lower costed one, but I wanted Mirror Image because there's a different printing of it that I love that looks like an anime girl. So we're just going to go ahead and put that one here so you guys can see it, because it raised the cost of a deck quite a bit to use this one, but we're going off of whatever the cheapest printing is on the card. So just remember that that is an option that we have here. Now, a budget deck always has one major restriction with it, though, and that is its land base. And Sephiroth is a 3-mana commander where she needs 3 different pips, so we need a land base that is able to get her out fast. So, let's talk about the lands. We are running 11 basics, 3 plains, 4 islands, 4 swamps. The rest, though, is fitted with a very, very robust package. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. We have Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse to search for any basic land. Ash Baron, which can come into play untapped or land cycle for a basic land. Shire Terrace, which allows us to crack it to get any type of basic land onto the board. Myriad Landscape, which lets us get any type of basic land onto the board as well. It gets 2 of them, though, so this also counts as land ramp. We also have Omni Lands here, Command Tower, Arcane Sanctum, Exotic Orchard, the Thriving Cycle. While I may not be a fan of the ones in here that come into play tapped, we are running a budget deck, so we need to run as good as we can there. Then we have our dual lands. These are our lands that don't have any other purpose than to just be 2 colors. So we have our reveal lands in Shine Shadow Snarl, Darkwater Catacombs, and Choked Estuary. Actually, Port Town is one of them. Then we have our Filtery lands in Darkwater Catacombs and Skycloud Expanse. And then we have a Tainted Field as well, because we did not have room for a Filter Orzhov land, so we're using a Tainted one instead. We also have a bunch of fetchable lands: Sunken Hollow, Prairie Stream, Snowfield Sinkhole, Irrigated Farmland, and Sunlit Marsh. These are all here because they either have a come into play untapped clause, or they say plains. And we have plains cycling and plains grabbing with Core Cartographer. We have ways to get plains out. So we want, even if these lands come into play tapped, we want them to be fetchable off of Core Cartographer. That's a very, very important thing, because it doesn't matter if your cards are basic, Cartographer can grab them anyway. But that is $15 Sephiroth. Remember, the idea is to have a commander that within a certain margin of error is under $1, and then a little less strict, the deck needs to be $15 or under, again with a little margin for error, because markets change prices when you build decks. The deck wants to be $15 or less. The commander wants to be $1 or less. The entire deck should be no more than $16 total. And the idea is not for it to be a weaker deck. The idea is these decks should be strong enough to play at any table that you are at that is not a CDH table. You should be able to take one of these decks to your locals, sit down, and play and be just as strong as everybody else, even without the massive budget that people sink into their commander decks. There were comments in the live chat asking me, did I have Damnation and other cards in the deck? And the answer is, this is a budget deck. Damnation would be the entire budget of the deck. So, no, that's not in here. But anyways, let me know what you think of the deck. Are there any changes you would make? Are there any cards you would fit in within the budget there? And what budget decks do you have that you want to brew or have made already? Let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. And there will be some $15 budget brew games that I'm going to be announcing here in a couple weeks on my new Discord. So please keep tuned for that. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And insert end video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.